So in this video we'll be looking at the regulation of the cell cycle. So when cell division happens and how often it happens is obviously very important. For a single-celled organism, that's its way of reproducing, and so that's really important. But for a multicellular organism as well, controlling the cell cycle is really important because for cells to divide it uses a lot of energy, and it also is going to cause growth. And you might be growing in all parts, or you might control only some parts that are growing and some parts that aren't. And that's really important in development, but also repair when tissue needs to be replaced. And so regulation of the cell cycle is key. The other thing that's very key is when there is no regulation of the cell cycle, this can cause major issues, such as cancer. Cancer itself is just and lack of regulation of growth of the cell cycle, and so cells are growing uncontrollably, and this is what leads to tumours. So this section is covered in Key Ideas 9 in pages 93 to 98 in the textbook, and we'll be looking at a few key terms. So as I've said, the control of the cell cycle is very important, especially in those multicellular organisms. This regulation of the cell cycle needs to come from external factors, such as the environment a cell might be growing in, or if it's in an organism, the surrounding cells help to provide that environment, and other parts of the body might even control growth. As well as that, there are internal factors. So these are based on the state of the cell, and if a cell is not ready to divide, then it won't be able to divide, for example. It needs to go through a process of growth, and then when it's ready, it can divide. So some of those external factors in an environment might be things like nutrients. So there's a nutrient dependence. If cells don't have enough nutrients, they won't be able to divide. Some cells like to be attached to a surface in order to grow. And we talk about this when we talk about cell culture, cells growing in petri dishes, for example. And there's also a density dependence. So if cells are too crowded closely together and there's no room to grow, then that will also be an external signal from the environment telling them not to grow. As well as that, like I said, there is a signaling system where other cells within an organism will signal to cells when it's time to grow. This often is in the form of growth factors or hormones that come from the brain and other glands to control growth in cells at various times in development. One of the key examples of this is the hormones that control puberty and growth factors that control your height and development. When we talk about internal factors, we're talking about a number of different protein and signaling systems within the cell that help to control the cell cycle. These include mitosis promoting factor, CDK, which stands for cyclin-dependent kinase, and cyclin. These three proteins we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. They help to trigger a progression through the cell cycle, which we're going to look at those key checkpoints in the cell cycle in the next set of slides. So when we have a look at this, as I said, there are a number of checkpoints which are used to ensure that the next stage of the cell cycle is viable. Like I said, it requires a lot of energy for a cell to complete the cell cycle, and there's no point in going forward if you're not ready. So here's a growth phase, G1. At the end of that, there's a checkpoint. Has the cell grown enough to commit to replicating DNA and progressing? If the checkpoint is met, then the cell will progress to the DNA synthesis side of things. DNA is doubled, ready for dividing the cell. Further growth is required, and then during G2, there's a checkpoint to see that the DNA was successfully copied and that the cell has all that it needs to enter mitosis. And once that's cleared, the cell can enter mitosis. And again, during mitosis, there's a checkpoint, because remember, it's quite complicated to bring together all those chromosomes, arrange them, and separate those out. If that process doesn't work, the cell doesn't want to go forward and divide. It needs to stay at that checkpoint until things are sorted out. Once that's cleared, we can go to cytokinesis, and one cell can split into two. And I talked about those internal factors, so let's have a quick look at how they work. So that's mitosis promoting factor, MPF, cyclin-dependent kinase, CDK, and cyclin. We'll start by having a look at the lower diagram. What we can see here is that CDK and cyclin are two protein components, and they go together to make the mitosis promoting factor. If we look at MPF, the levels of that go up when mitosis occurs, and then they drop off. And then next time MPF is high, mitosis can happen again, it drops off, and again, and drops off. So MPF, as the name suggests, promotes mitosis to happen, and the cells can pass through that part of the cell cycle. But how does that regulation occur? Well, the way it works is that what you can see from these dot points is that the CDK levels remain high throughout the cell cycle, but MPF can't form without cyclin. And so what we see here is that cyclin is being made and then destroyed, slowly being made and then destroyed, and accumulating during that interphase, the growth cycle. When the levels of cyclin are sufficient, MPF forms and mitosis occurs. So CDK is going around the whole cell cycle. Cyclin is accumulating. Once there's enough cyclin there, it'll join with the CDK to make MPF, and mitosis happens. At the end of mitosis, there are processes that destroy the cyclin and inactivate the MPF. That's more or less the regulation of the cell cycle.